If you've been listening to this podcast for some time, you'll know that we love to interrogate the unseen forces that shape today's world, be they political or social or economic. One of these forces we've yet to fully interrogate on the podcast is also one of the most ubiquitous. As my guest this week argues, it's so ever-present that we take it for granted. It's imprinted into our world so deeply that we no longer notice it. As I say to him during the conversation, it's everything everywhere all at once. It affects what we eat, what we watch, and even who and how we love. And yet, Sven Beckert says, capitalism is very recent, very revolutionary, and entirely human-made. As Sven says in his new book, Capitalism, A Global History, sometimes the most difficult things to grasp are the most familiar. Capitalism is one of them. Sven is Lede Bell Professor of History at Harvard University, and his new book is a wager, he writes, that capitalism's entire history might be understood, if not wholly contained, between two book covers. You'll notice the subtitle of his book, A Global History. Some of the main critiques of the capitalist process, even before the process was even given that name, such as Adam Smith and Karl Marx, were written from Europe. And so, argues Sven, the subsequent discourse around capitalism was warped by a Eurocentric lens. He set out to correct that. And so we start our discussion, like he starts his book, in the Yemeni city of Aden, and take in Abbasid Baghdad, Guangzhou in China, Barbados and Venice along the way. I think many discussions of capitalism can quite easily be pinpointed on the political spectrum, with critics often on the left and fans on the right. But Sven certainly wouldn't want his analysis of capitalism to be so casually given a political label. Indeed, he thinks any such readings are wrong. Capitalism itself, he says, is far too undogmatic to justify such labels. For such a niche, if all-encompassing subject, Sven's book has received plenty of critical attention, and I think some critics didn't quite know what to make of such an ambitious analysis of such a huge subject. But as he tells me, the history of capitalism is constantly developing. We started off this season with another history book that tried to reframe our understanding of a major world event, namely the development of the African continent, with a discussion of Zainab Badawi's book, An African History of Africa. I think this is a similarly important conversation given the extent to which capitalism affects our lives and how little we currently understand it. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Sven Beckert, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Faisal.
I thought we would start this conversation where you start the book. And you say at the beginning that it's impossible to pinpoint an exact starting place or the moment of capitalism. But you begin the book in the port city of Aden in Yemen in the year 1150, with a look at a class of people that you say are central to the development of modern capitalism. And these people are merchants. So let's talk about that. Why do you think this merchant class makes them so central to the subsequent development of capitalism?
Yes, that's a really great question, Faisal. And as you know, scholars for the past 150 years have tried to identify the exact moment when capitalism emerged, and they have tried to identify the exact place where it emerged. And they have come up with a whole variety of places and times from, looking at the history of Florence in the 13th century or 14th century, to looking at Amsterdam in the 16th or 17th century, to looking at London in the 18th century, Manchester in the 19th century, New York City in the 20th century, and some cities like Shenzhen and China in the 1st century. And I think this is problematic for two reasons. For one, I think the emergence of capitalism is best understood as a process and not as just kind of one moment in time in which capitalism kind of was born and then spread all around the world. So I think to find this one date and to find this one place is bound to fail. And second, as you noticed, when I listed the names of the places that have been used to identify the origins of capitalism, most of them are on the continent of Europe. And this leads to a very Eurocentric accounting of the story of capitalism. So my basic starting point of this book is that capitalism, the capitalist revolution, needs to be understood as a process that unfolded over many centuries, and it needs to be understood as a global process, and we need to keep the globe in mind when we think about the emergence of capitalism and any other moment in its history. That said, that now led me to the merchant communities of the first half of the second millennium, of the years between 1000 and 1500, because what I was looking for is capitalism is a kind of radical new logic structuring economic life on planet Earth. And this logic is radically different from how economic life on planet Earth was structured previously. And even once the kind of first inklings of capitalism begin to emerge, other logics of organizing economic life remained quite powerful. But the group of people who I think first embraced this peculiar economic logic that is at the core of what capitalism is about. The first group of people who embraced that logic, I think, were long distance merchants. The people who invested their capital in long distance trade, in this case, in order to produce more capital.
These are the sedentary merchants you're talking about. The pieces in the port cities where they put their goods on a boat and it goes somewhere far away.
So they put their wheat or their brass or their horses or their textiles on a boat in the port of Aden. I start the book in the port of Aden in present-day Yemen, and they ship it to the western coast of India or to the eastern coast of Africa, and it takes a year or two even before the boat returns to their port. So these are traders, but these are particular kinds of traders. These are not the kinds of traders who sell meat at the market or vegetables in the village square.
And they are people, to understand it, they are people who have to first put up quite a lot of money. They have to pay the sailors and the boats, and they have to make sure that they're not going to get the money back for a year or two. And they need all these other things, which we'll come to, all the infrastructure of capitalism, that they have to be sure that no one's going to take it from them. And when it gets to the other cities, for example, it gets to Mumbai or Goa, wherever it's going, that it's not just going to be stolen. And that even if it is sold, when they come back, they're going to give them the money or whatever they're trading.
Right. So they need a fair amount of capital. They need to embed their activities in all kinds of institutions, which they create in the process of building these kinds of trade networks. And the point here is, so the logic, this kind of radical new economic logic, it begins to emerge in these kinds of communities, in these communities of long distance traders. And these communities of long distance traders, you find in many different parts of the world, not just on the European continent. You find them in China in the early, in the first half of the second millennium. You find them in China, you find them in India, you find them in the East Coast of Africa, the West Coast of Africa, the Arab world, and of course also on the continent of Europe. So this logic emerges in very many different parts of the world. And then in a way, at this time, in the first half of the second millennium, this logic is strikingly modern. When we listen to these traders, we immediately understand what they do, because we tend to do the same thing today. But at the moment when they emerged, it was a radical departure of how most economic life on planet Earth was organized. And these were kind of small islands of capital, these small communities in a world that was organized differently. Today, we live in a world in which most of our economic life and most of the rest of our lives are organized along this capitalist logic. And in a way, the book describes how we get from a point in which this logic existed, but was marginal, to a moment today in which this logic determines almost all aspects.
It's everywhere and always, yeah. So I like this description of the way that you've explained the beginnings of capitalism, and your description of Aden as well. You put it as a trade nexus between Asia and Africa and Middle East and Europe. And Aden, of course, I mean, in reality is protected by these rock formations and by walls, completely surrounded by the sea. And you call it a fortified node of capital, an island of capitalists, and capitalism originated on these islands. And the other port islands that you talk about, as you've mentioned, is Guangzhou in China today and in Venice. And what I like about this idea is exactly as you've described it, that it starts off in this very small way, and then to the point today where it is everywhere, and you can't even imagine our modern world without capitalism.
Right. Yeah, it's there 1,000 years ago, but it's completely marginal to economic life on Earth. And today it's absolutely at the center of economic life and our life.
Another set of ideas created in the Arab world, which has been exported around the world. Another one that has created problems for all.
Yes, I mean, I don't argue that capitalism or this logic originates in the Arab world. It's one point where it originates. It also originates in China, in India, in Africa, and Europe. So this is not unique to the Arab world. But I like to tell, I mean, throughout the book, I like to tell the history of capitalism from a global perspective, but I like to tell that global story from a local vantage point. And I tell the story of these early merchant communities through the local vantage point of looking in some detail at the port of Aden and its merchants.
We will come to some of the global south conversation about these other places in the world, but I want us to just get into the underlying logic of capitalism. I found this distinction quite useful, the distinction between trade and capitalism, because one of the things that is at the heart of your book is this idea that we are living through a particular iteration of capitalism, and it's not the same as what people might have thought of as trade in the past. So I think when people think about the underlying logic of capitalism, people often think that it's something like, you barter something, or you buy and you sell it, or something like this. And that way of exchange has existed since we built societies. You don't make that claim. You think that capitalism
No, exactly. I think some people think that capitalism is the same as markets. But as far as we know, markets have existed in all human societies. So this cannot possibly and plausibly define of what capitalism is. Of course, capitalism is also a market society, but so were other societies previously.
Yeah. And you think what distinguishes modern capitalism from these previous iterations is the scale of the global connections, and then also the speed of the change.
And it's a privately owned capital productively invested to produce more capital as the kind of logic, as the determining logic of capitalism. And this is distinct from just trade.
So when we think about historians, we often think that they treat capitalism as if it is like the only economic model that could possibly be imagined, the kind of Francis Fukuyama end of economics idea. And you don't accept that at all. You talk about this aberrant period, and you say that at its core, capitalism is and was a radical departure and discontinuity in human affairs. So how did we get there from these small port cities to this capitalism idea that is so ubiquitous that, as you write in the book, it is imprinted our world so deeply that it's not even possible to notice it?
So, yes, exactly. A core argument of this book is that, unlike what some ideologues believe, capitalism is not the natural state of the world. This is one particular form of organizing economic life. And as you just said, it's a radical departure from other forms of economic life that have existed previously, such as subsistence-oriented economies or tributary economies that have existed in many different parts of the world. But the logic, the capitalist logic, as we discussed, already existed in the first half of the second millennium, and maybe elements of that existed even earlier. And the question is now exactly how to explain how this logic spread into ever more spheres of life and how it spread into ever more areas of the world. And I think what is decisive here is that in the second half of the second millennium, so after 1500, these merchants who have become partly very wealthy by organizing that kind of long-distance trade, they now begin to invest their capital. They begin to push their capital into producing things that they trade. They are not happy anymore just to confine their activities to the sphere of overseas trade, but they also invest their capital into structuring production. And they first and foremost invest their capital, of course, in what was then the dominant economic activity on planet Earth, namely in agrarian and agricultural activities. And I tell that story through the recasting of the wine industry in Burgundy in France. And I tell this story also through the recasting of sugar production on the Caribbean island of Barbados. And then, of course, they also push their capital into manufacturing activities. Just think about the proto-industrial sector in India, or the porcelain industry in China, or also the textile industry you find in many different parts of Europe. And these three processes, the intensification of trade, the investment of capital into agrarian production, and then also the increasing domination of manufacturing by merchants and by capital owners, that then brings about the Industrial Revolution, which completely changes economic life on planet Earth. And so, to get back to our early discussions, many observers point to the Industrial Revolution as the origins of capitalism, and I disagree with that. I think the Industrial Revolution is really the most important offspring of the revolution. And therefore, we need to understand these earlier words of merchants in order to understand how we ever got to something as important as the Industrial Revolution.
Agreed. And I want us to talk about that early life. I think that is so interesting, and it's something that the audience will not have heard. As you say, a lot of these histories focus on the post-16th century and they don't focus on what came before. Before we get into that, I just want to hear you tell the story that I think for our American audience, they will find very interesting, because you mentioned this fascinating vignette early in the book about a Puritan back in the US, wasn't the US then, but in 1639. And he found himself in front of the court, the General Court of Massachusetts, where he was accused of, quote, the very evil and corrupt practice of overcharging his customers and placing profit above the community's needs. And the court was told this man, Robert Keene, this is what he had done, this is the terrible thing that he had done, he had embraced false principles, including that a man might sell as dear as he can, as expensive as he can, and buy as cheap as he can. And I think for many of our American listeners, they'll be listening to that going, I don't see where the problem is.
Right, no, but presumably for your European listeners as well, right? Because this is the way how we think of the world today. This is considered to be an entirely natural way of thinking about conducting business. And so it's really quite shocking, to see how in 17th century New England, this was something that was criminal. This was considered to be totally outside the norms of the community. And what this shows again is how radical a departure the capitalist revolution really was. Once upon a time, people thought of this kind of economic behavior as not only illegitimate, but sacrilegious. It was against the most basic laws of religious life and social life. And so there you see, how radical this change really is. And here we're talking about the 17th century.
Right, exactly. It's so recent.
Oh, it's relatively late, you know.
Right.
100 years into that.
And in a society that many people will recognize in the early United States. This guy was eventually fined. I imagine that story is quite a lot like the stories of rich people, billionaires today getting in trouble, that you start off by being shocked and then you go, they can afford it, it's fine about it. Right. I want us to consider then this point that you were making about how it changed and why it changed. I want to start with a quote. You said that if you live in Cairo or Guangzhou or Florence, you live in a place where the sprouts of capitalism stretch back a long time, perhaps a millennium. But those places are truly exceptional. And I want us to think about why capitalism changed from something that was unusual into something that is, as you said earlier, just it's everywhere, everything everywhere all at once. And the example that you use in the book is the spread of Islam. So I want to quote a little bit from the book about it. For several centuries, the Islamic world constituted itself as the center of the global economy, its heartland. This centrality arose because of the urban bias of Islamic civilization itself. And as Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula to West Asia, North Africa, Central Asia, and South and Southeast Asia, and then eventually into Southern Europe, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, I was reading this thing and you're like, wow, this is a long, long list. No wonder you are creating the underlying infrastructure of what becomes capitalism. But I'll keep going. It created an ever larger zone of unification, and communities were linked across vast distances, and trade grew alongside religious and political ties. So traders could travel freely, communicate across vast swathes of land and sea, and they had, through Islam, a legal framework and a set of shared institutions. Now, that part of the story, it seems to me, why it's so interesting is that it's part of the global story, and as you say, it is part of the background to the Industrial Revolution, but somehow we don't consider that part of the story at all.
Yeah, exactly, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Because for one, I think, a Eurocentric view of history has become kind of unfashionable in the past decade or so. But I think when it comes to understanding the history of capitalism, it is still the predominant way of understanding that story, to understand it as a story that is primarily about the continent of Europe from the earliest beginnings of capitalism almost to the present. And it relegates the rest of humanity to a totally marginal role, or the rest of humanity is completely ignored in that story. So this is the one reason of why I think we have ignored this earlier history. And then second, partly, if you start the story in 1760 or 1780 with the Industrial Revolution, if you leave out all this kind of earlier transformation of agriculture, this earlier transformation of manufacturing, this earlier intensification of trade, then suddenly the story about that you just mentioned is lost, is not mentioned at all. And the problem with this is, there are two problems with this. The first problem is, I think you misunderstand the history of capitalism. You don't properly understand the history of capitalism if you don't embed it in a longer time frame and if you don't embed it in the history of the world as a whole. And second, look at the world today. Clearly, the most dynamic parts of the global capitalist economy are not to be found on the European continent. I mean, this is totally uncontroversial. They are more or less found in various parts of Asia. If that is the case, there must be some history to that dynamic as well. And therefore, to understand the present, we need to understand the past in new and novel ways. When most people wrote about capitalism in the 19th century, they lived in a world in which Europe indeed was very central to the global economy. It was a Eurocentric century, the 19th century. And so in some ways, for those people, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and others, it made sense to spend so much analytical energy trying to understand the European continent. But now we don't live in this world anymore. We live in a world that is truly global, in which Asia, but also parts of Africa, Latin America, North America, of course, play a crucial role in the history of capitalism. And that's why we need to rethink its entire history.
That's very interesting, because that positions this European North American experience of a couple of centuries as being very much an aberration, that you go back to how it was before, where the bulk of trade was in those parts of the world, what we think of as the global south today.
Yes, no, exactly. I mean, for a long time, the center of, for example, the world's manufacture was in China and in what is now India, not on the European continent. But Europe did become really important in the 18th century. It was at the center, clearly, of the world economy in the 19th and throughout much of the 20th century. So we need to explain that too. We need to also look at why Europe became so important to that story. But yes, it was a moment in this longer history. It was a moment of about 250 years. And now that we are at the other end of this moment, we can, I think, also rethink the entire history of this global capitalism, especially by thinking about it from a global perspective.
There was something in that part about the Islamic world which I thought was really interesting. I'll just read the core of it and then I'll make the point. This is the quote from your book. The dynamic core of this Islamic trade world, and thus of the world economy, was trade with Asia generally and with Indian Ocean cities in particular. The Indian Ocean was ringed by cities, each connected to its own hinterland and its ecological resources that could be mobilized there. They were then connected by a middle sea route via Baghdad, Basra and Hormuz, a northern land route via Samarkand and Bukhara, and a southern sea route via Aden. Now, it occurred to me in reading that most of these places have been forgotten. They've fallen off the world map. Even Middle East watchers will be familiar with the Strait of Hormuz, which is the body of water that separates Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. But they've forgotten that it was named after the island of Hormuz, which was one of the most important trade centers in that part of the world.
Right. No, I think that's true. I mean, obviously, among experts, that story is known, but among a kind of broader public, this has been written out of the history of capitalism. You know, everybody has heard about France, about its trade, about its woolen industry, about the Medici, but very few people have heard about the traders of a city like Cairo, Damascus, or Baghdad, or other such cities. And look, I think the best way to think about this is perhaps by thinking about, you know, when the Europeans embarked upon overseas trade, long distance overseas trade, when the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the Genoese, when they set out into the Atlantic world, what they were looking for.
What they were trying to do, exactly, yeah.
Trying to find a way to South Asia and to China, because they had understood, not only then, but for centuries, that they had understood that the world's wealth is concentrated in these regions in the world. And they wanted to trade with these regions of the world. And they wanted to get around these pesky Arab traders who were in between.
In between them, right.
And Europe. And so Christopher Columbus, who was a Genoese merchant, set out to find a route to India by going westward. And to the end of his days, he believed that he had found this route. And obviously, the Europeans had discovered the Americas in the process. But I think that speaks exactly to this point of, contemporaries were very much aware of the importance of that part of the world.
I wanted to move on to the politics of capitalism. We had the Financial Times journalist Victor Mallet on the podcast just this week, and he was discussing the success of the far right in France. And he noted that the success of the far-right party has really come from people who used to be left-wing, now voting for these far-right parties. And what surprised me about your book is that you made a similar point, I think, about capitalism. As you put it, quote, conservative critics of capitalism have been common throughout its long history. Both Karl Marx and the Chinese Communist Party hailed the emancipatory economic possibilities of the capitalist revolution. So how is it that we've got to the point now where if you are a defender of capitalism, you are associated with conservatism, when actually, as you say in the book, it was a revolutionary practice, and some of these groups that we think of as being revolutionary, communists and so on, recognize it as such?
Right. So this is another very basic misunderstanding of capitalism that is quite common and that I try to correct in the book, namely that often capitalism is thought of as a kind of conservative way of organizing the world. But in reality, as we discussed, capitalism is perhaps the most impactful revolution in economic life that ever unfolded on planet Earth. And capitalism, I think, is best seen as a state of permanent revolution. And of course, because capitalism challenged the authority, the power, the wealth of rulers, from the church to feudal rulers in Europe or other tributary rulers in other parts of the world, it encountered enormous resistances from traditional elites who the last thing they wanted is some, merchant participating in exploiting the peasant. They wanted to keep exploiting the peasant, and they didn't necessarily want to give the peasant, new opportunities, let's say, to trade their production.
And you say actually in the book that a lot of these people, the landed gentry and so on, they looked at the process of taking money and making more money as something like sorcery.
Correct, because they understood wealth to come mostly from the land, and they were wealthy. Rich people existed before capitalism, but they mostly accumulated their wealth by just taking it from the peasant or massively taxing peasants to part with some of their meager surplus. So the capitalist revolution encountered enormous resistances from traditional elites. And of course, once the capitalist revolution got going, it created partly upheaval in the countryside that produced massive resistances also from common people, from slaves, from farmers, from rural cultivators of all kinds. And then it also created new kinds of social inequalities, new patterns of inequality. Namely, most important, it created a huge class of people who made a living of selling their labor power, who worked in factories, but also partly on farms. And these people in the 19th century, they began to organize in trade unions and left-wing political parties. And they also opposed much of the capitalist revolution. Sometimes they wanted to reform that capitalism. Sometimes they wanted to overcome this capitalism. So the capitalist revolution has been attacked both from the left and the right. But what I think what is important in the context maybe of the contemporary politics that you mentioned earlier is that we grew up in Europe and the United States. We grew up with the notion that somehow the capitalist revolution almost naturally brings about liberal democratic outcomes, right? The richer we get, the more there is going to be a middle class. That middle class is going to want political participation, and that is going to result in a liberal democratic society. And, broadly speaking, that has been not completely wrong, this notion, because we can see, that beginning with the 18th century, there is a kind of turn towards more liberal democratic forms of political rule. And that, of course, goes along with the expansion of capitalism at the same time as well. But what we can also see, if we look at the long history of capitalism, is that capitalism has thrived perfectly well under of monarchical rule, in empires, colonial rule. It has thrived under forms of authoritarian, even fascist rule. And therefore, I think from a long historical perspective, we must see that capitalism is generally undogmatic, and it's also undogmatic in terms of the form of political rule in which it is embedded. And in some ways now we see, that suddenly, once upon a time, a very attractive idea that capitalism leads to an expansion of liberal democratic systems, that this is now questioned because we see that some of the most dynamic capitalist societies in the world today are definitely not liberal and
Exactly.
not democratic.
All across the Arab Gulf, in Singapore, now in the cities in China, completely authoritarian governments. And yet, as you say, they are the most dynamic places where capitalism is practiced.
Yes, yes. And I think we can only properly understand that if we engage the history of capitalism and if we engage the whole thing, if we engage it over 1,000 years of history and if we engage it in the context of the entire world. Because even if we look at the 19th century and 20th century, we see the expansion, as I said, of liberal democratic regimes. But if we look at the entire world, we see also this goes along with, authoritarian forms of colonial rule in much of the rest of the world. So even this high point of liberal democratic rule, if you think about Britain, goes along with kind of forms of colonial domination in much of the rest of the world.
In most of the territories that the British were administering. Let's talk about the soup of capitalism, this idea that we are the goldfish and capitalism surrounds us in the water and we don't even really notice it. I was going to start by asking you what you think of capitalism. I know that some of your critics have suggested that you don't much like it. Do you think that in its current iteration, it is broadly a good system, or do you think that there are huge problems with it?
Look, I think the book is, not primarily interested in engaging this particular question, because the book is interested. The starting point of the book is that the emergence and the spread of capitalism is the most impactful revolution in economic affairs in human history in the past 1,000 years. It is dominating and structuring our lives today. In order to understand where we are right now, we need to first and foremost understand this long history of capitalism. And so this is what my book is trying to do. And I'm trying to tell the entire thing. So I'm talking about the enormous productivity gains that the capitalist revolution brought about. It talks about the enormous economic growth that the capitalist revolution has brought about. It's talking about that in some parts of the world, in large parts of the world, we live better lives, we live longer lives with much greater opportunities to consume than anyone ever had in human history before. But I'm also talking about the history of colonialism, the history of enslavement, and other such things that are also part and parcel of the history of capitalism. But it's not so much a book, I think, that is animated by, capitalism is the greatest thing ever, or capitalism is the worst thing that ever happened in human history. But it's a book that is really animated by trying to understand how we got to where we are and to understand this kind of full history of capitalism in all of its diversities and all of its facets.
One of the parts that I find very interesting about the idea of us being surrounded by capitalism is that you might consider these the more insidious aspects, like the commodification of the human self, because capitalism has even found its way into what we watch, how we watch it, how we find people to be in relationships with, what we eat, when we can eat it. We don't follow the schedule of buying things that are now made locally. They're making blueberries on the other side of the world and they're shipping them to us within a couple of days. It's really infected every part of us. And I wonder if you think that that is a positive thing, or it's something that creates different types of humans eventually.
I mean, I think it does. It does change every aspect of our lives, and therefore it does need explaining. And this is one of the kind of core themes of the book, exactly the spread of capitalism, or what I call the process of commodification, that you see both spatially. I mean, we talked about this already, how this logic spreads from these islands of capital deeper into society, and it spreads to almost all corners of the world nowadays, except maybe North Korea. But that's not all. As you say, it also spreads into new spheres of our lives, into our relationship, how we work, how we think, how we interact with one another. And so capitalism that's why I'm saying capitalism is an important fact in our lives. And in some ways it dominates our lives, and people have different opinions if this is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think first and foremost, we have to say, yes, it's definitely the case. This is something that has changed our lives.
I feel like we are living through, this is my little theory, I feel that we are living through this mini age of capitalism that started after the 2008 financial crisis. I think it's interesting that we seem to be living through a moment in which a significant portion of the public and the capitalist West, and I'll put it in American terms, from the Bernie Sanders left to the MAGA right feel that there is something wrong with capitalism. I get the sense from the latter parts of the book, particularly the epilogue, that that is something that you might agree with.
No, I very much agree with this. So I don't think that as such allows us to completely predict the future of capitalism. I mean, maybe I should make 2 points. The first one is that the end of capitalism has been predicted for 150 or 200 years. And obviously, much of the history of capitalism unfolded after the first prediction of its imminent demise. So capitalism is enormously dynamic. Capitalism, as I mentioned, is quite undogmatic, and capitalism has encountered a lot of crises, many much deeper than the current crisis. So, for example, the crisis of 1929, and it has navigated these crises and come out of these crises. So that's the first thing to be said. The second thing to be said is that change in capitalism, on the one hand, is continuous. We have every year, we have a little bit more production, economic growth, new technologies, and so on. But partly it's discontinuous because capitalism is not just economic growth, but capitalism is also kind of an institutional system, an institutional regime. And that regime can be amazingly stable for longer periods of time, but can then also suddenly shift quite drastically. And it has shifted quite drastically, for example, during the New Deal in the 1930s. It shifted quite drastically with the onset of the neoliberal revolution in the 1970s. And I think now we are again at a moment of regime change within capitalism.
Within capitalism itself.
And you see that exactly for the factors that you mentioned. You see that there is a kind of economic crisis of the kind that we saw in 2008, which has brought about enormous economic tensions globally. It has brought about economic inequality that's much sharpened, but it also has brought about opposition against this particular mode of the capitalist order. And this opposition comes from the left. Think about Occupy Wall Street, all of that. It has particularly come from the authoritarian populist right. And yes, I don't know how much that is a kind of fundamental critique of capitalism, but what it certainly is a fundamental critique of the particular order in capitalism, namely the neoliberal order, under which we have lived for the past 50 years, and which, of course, also sold itself as the natural state of things. As something that we can't do anything about. That was how the world was supposed to be. And everybody opposed to that order was presented as somehow being against godly or economic laws. But now we see, okay, this is not the case. Capitalism has shape-shifted a lot in its history. We can see that from the long history of looking at capitalism. And I think we might find ourselves right now in exactly such a moment. It's not determined where we're going to go next, but it's, I think, pretty certain that we're not going to continue where we left off a few years ago.
You agree with me that this is a kind of mini period where something significant seems to be shifting? Yeah.
Yes, I think we cannot quite navigate it yet because we don't know, where this is going to lead.
Right.
There's some very dark possibilities in this.
I completely agree.
But I think this is not set. This is not determined. And it's also a moment in which we can actually shape the world in which we live. During the neoliberal era, it was often very difficult to imagine alternative futures because this was just such a powerful way of thinking about the world and how the world was structured. And now all of this has been questioned from the left and the right. And so we can rethink the world, how we want to organize our economic life, in what kind of institutions we want to have this economic life be embedded. And that is scary, sure, because everybody likes stability, but it's also, I think, an opportunity.
Well, the instability is already part of the system. I don't think the people wanting political change are creating that instability. Instability is there. I want to end by thinking, because you talk about how we're in this particular phase of capitalism, and I wondered what you thought the next phase might look like. Do you think that the next phase is more of a, to speak generally, an Asian phase? Do you think that it might look very different in different parts of the world? I mean, let's extrapolate forward, let's say 100 years, because you started with the port city of Aden. So let's extrapolate forward 100 years and we are somewhere in one of the port cities of China.
This future is so far in the future that we don't personally have to care if we get it wrong because we won't be there.
I mean, I fully intend to be there. I don't know about you, but I fully intend to be in Guangzhou in 100 years. But in any case...
You report back to us,
But I mean, what do you think that phase of capitalism, we've talked about how the politics of it can be separated from the underlying economic structure. Do you think...
Look, I think capitalism, because you ask, will the world look more alike? I think that's probably not the case. I think capitalism has always been a way of organizing economic activity that was quite diverse in different parts of the world. It was always connected, but it also showcased always great diversity in terms of labor, in terms of territorial regimes, in terms of political regimes. Presumably, this is going to continue into the future. So then I think what we can also see is that the kind of geographic center of the capitalist economy throughout capitalism's history has shifted from the Arab world into Southern Europe, into Northern Europe, into the United States, and then into perhaps China today. So presumably that process is going to continue. And if we are not completely misreading the present, then I think we can be fairly confident in saying that some parts of Asia are going to become kind of the center of the global capitalist economy in the future. But exactly what this capitalism is going to look like, or what this world is going to look like, more broadly speaking, is impossible. And, this also depends on us, because we are the ones in some way or another who are creating the future. I mean, one of the points of this book is exactly that capitalism is not just kind of impersonal system that works itself out without human intervention. No, the argument is very much that we are the shapers of this form of economic life. And capitalism has shifted drastically over time. The capitalism of the 1930s in the United States was drastically different from the capitalism of Manchester in the 1850s. And that was drastically different from the capitalism in the year 2025 in, let's say, in Singapore. And so this change is continuous. It presumably will also be continuous into the future. And how we shape our world is going to be impactful in forging the world that our grandchildren are going to live in.
Sven Beckert, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Faisal. That was great.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Sven Beckert's book, Capitalism, A Global History, is out now and available online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Addison and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.